Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the Bear Market Brief.
Listeners of this podcast and readers of BMB Russia may know that I'm interested in language. I'm curious about how words are used, how they emerge, how they change, and admittedly, I can be prone to a bout of wordplay now and again. There's a word that has entered usage in Ukrainian since Russia's latest invasion, and that word is Rashist. It's a combination of the words for Russian and fascist, and there we arrive at the topic of this episode, the F word, fascism. Welcome to the Bear Market Brief podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Schwartzbaum, and on this episode, we are going to evaluate whether or not Russia is fascist. There's certainly been an authoritarian turn in the country over the last decade or two, but we're going to be exploring this specific term. Now, when it comes to a question like this, there's really two pieces here. One is the academic piece. What does the word mean and does it apply? And then there's the practical piece. How is the word used and what sentiments does it generate? What policies does it lead to? We're going to be focused predominantly on the former today. Who is we, you may be wondering? Fair question. I had two very authoritative guests for this episode. Dr. Marlene Laruelle is a research professor of international affairs and political science at the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. She is also director of the Illiberalism Studies program at GW and the former director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies there. She has been working on Russia's ideological landscape and its outreach abroad for more than 2 decades. She published the book Is Russia Fascist in 2021, and her next book, Ideology and Meaning Making Under the Putin Regime, will be released this fall. Second, but none the lesser, is Dr. Julian Waller. Julian is a research analyst in the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analyses, a professorial lecturer in political science, and a non-resident fellow at the Illiberalism Studies program at GW. His research focuses on Russian political military affairs, the politics of post-Soviet Eurasia, comparative authoritarianism, and ideological illiberalism in Europe, Eurasia, and North America. His upcoming co-authored book, Autocrats Can't Always Get What They Want, State Institutions and Autonomy Under Authoritarianism, is coming out in August of this year. For good measure, our usual caveat that the opinions in this episode are ours alone. It sounds like we'll have to have both of these guests back to discuss their books, but at any rate, we had a great conversation. Let's dive in. Marlene, Julian, welcome to the Bear Market Brief. Great to have you with us today. Let's start with a round of quick introductions, starting with Marlene. Tell us a little bit about your research.
So, hello, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm a research professor at the George Washington University. I'm also there leading the Illiberalism Study program, and I've been working on Russia and on Russia's ideological market and production and its soft power abroad for the last 20 years.
And Julian.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm a research analyst in the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analysis, which is a government FFRDC, kind of like RAND or another corporation. I also teach at George Washington University. I teach Russian politics there, and I'm a fellow at the Illiberalism Studies program as well. In my day job, I mostly focus on Russian political military affairs, study the Russian armed forces, how it relates to the political system, and so on. But otherwise, I also work academically on authoritarianism, illiberalism, and other related topics.
So if you listeners didn't catch from the title of this episode, all about illiberalism today. So let's turn over our first question, dive right into it to Marlene, who literally wrote the book on this. And I mean this, wrote a book entitled Is Russia Fascist? So not using that as a figure of speech. Yes or no answer here. Quickly, right off the bat, we'll dig into this in just a minute. You wrote this book in 2021, before everything that's happened in Ukraine most recently. In 2021, was Russia fascist?
My answer in the book was no, because Russia didn't fit the definition of fascism.
Why did you feel the urge or curiosity to ask that question then?
Because there was already a lot of media, think tanks, expert discussion on this question since mostly 2014 and Crimea annexation. Already a lot of very visible vocal voices coming from Central Europe, but also from some Western circles were already saying that Russia is fascist. The topic was not really very present among political scientists at that time, but it was very visible in the kind of think tank and media world. And so I wanted to address the question.
And so we are going to address the heck out of it today. So as political scientists here, it's really our challenge here is to do two things. It is to examine Russia's political system. We have to define its characteristics in some way. And to examine fascism, what does that word actually mean in our definition? And then kind of overlay them, see the extent to which they match up. So 2 tasks for today, something I'm sure we could do in 5 hours, but can we do it in about half an hour? We shall see. Let's talk about Russia's politics these days. Julian, we'll kick this one over to you. How have they changed since Russia's latest invasion of Ukraine? And what are some of the words we hear used to describe them?
Sure, yeah. Well, when we think about Russia, we have to understand that this is a long-standing authoritarian regime. Authoritarian regime, when we use the term authoritarianism, we mean any sort of political regime that is not identifiably an electoral democracy, right? So authoritarian regimes come in a variety of flavors, sizes. You can have military juntas, absolute monarchies. You can have sort of hybrid regimes of various styles. You can have personalist dictatorships, party states such as in China. Russia traditionally we would categorize as an electoral authoritarian regime, which means it has the formal trappings of liberal democratic constitutions, right? Elections for legislatures and for the executive, technically checking institutions, right? It's a presidentialist system with courts, with the legislature, with an executive, so on and so forth. It looks, if you squint a lot, it looks like a democracy that we might understand in the 21st century. Constitution has rights guarantees and so on. Of course, that's not truly the case. That's not de facto what Russia looks like. And so we append the authoritarianism term onto that. And that's what Putin has built over the last 20 years. And over time, he's become increasingly in full control of the political system as a whole, right? So the competitive nature of elections decreased over the course of the 2000s quite substantially. At a certain point, we started referring to it as a hegemonic electoral authoritarian regime. If you talk to our colleague Henry Hale at GW, he will call it a patronal regime as well, based on the sort of informality of connections between elites in kind of a hierarchical sense. And with the war, there's sort of a new stage in the regime in which the formal institutions still certainly exist, right? There are still elections, there's still a parliament, the president is still directly elected. It's not a hereditary monarch yet, necessarily. However, it's gone into a state of exception, right? So the rules as written don't apply as much as they used to. And furthermore, it's increasingly understood as a personalist dictatorship. Sort of all power is centered on the apex executive in the figure of Vladimir Putin personally. Now, that personalist component was always a part of the system. It is now essentially the defining characteristic and feature.
Marlene, thoughts on where Russia's politics stands now?
I agree with Julian. The regime has been evolving over the last 25 years, and now we have this kind of consolidated personalistic regime that is there. We also see an evolution in terms of the ideological construction. It moved from a kind of moderate conservatism that was still pretty well kind of functioning in a globalized world with links with the West, a kind of Russian version of liberal conservatism as we can find it in Europe. And it gradually moved to a conservatism that is now really focused on being critical and opposing the West, becoming more and more reactionary in its vision of the society, of the moral order. So here also an evolution that I've been growing up, kind of, I call that the sedimentation process of the regime over a quarter of century that Julian mentioned, both in terms of changing institution gradually and also changing the core ideological nature of the regime and its vision of the world order and the societal order at home.
I have a follow-up question here. Another word that came up early in the episode, illiberal. What does that mean, and how does that interplay with dictatorship, with authoritarianism? Tell me what that means.
I can begin and Julian may follow. I will begin with the kind of ideological content and Julian may follow on the relationship between illiberalism and authoritarianism. In terms of more kind of ideological contents, we see liberalism as a backlash against liberal democratic system and something that is an ideological universe that is insisting on the fact that liberalism failed in or was excessive, and that now this kind of backlash of reaction is calling for an ideological system, a world order where sovereignty of nation state will be dominating over multilateral supranational institution, where the society should be homogeneous, so less plurality, less diversity, more homogeneity, where majoritarian institutions should be prevailing over minority oriented institution, and also a kind of conservative social order with respect for hierarchy, both in terms of gender, family definition, and kind of traditional societal hierarchy. So that's a very broad definition of illiberalism. It also comes in many different flavors. And on that, Russia and the Putin's regime has been really leading, in a sense, in the early 2000s in framing this kind of illiberal reaction that we have seen after that kind of growing in many other countries.
Julian, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's absolutely right. Marlene also has written the articles and books on illiberalism and sort of defining it as such, as this kind of overall modern reaction against a perception of hegemonic liberalism, understood politically, culturally, socially, and economically. The distinction that we want to make here, and we're gonna try to be careful with words, because you can call anything whatever you want. We can't stop you. But if we want to use it as a scholarly concept, that is something that exists ontologically in the world, that can be used to describe patterns as we see them, as phenomena, we have to be careful. So when we think about illiberalism, we're thinking about an ideology, right? We're thinking about ideas, a family of ideas, and sort of a way of thinking about the world, a worldview. When we think about something, about its relationship to something like authoritarianism, we have to understand when we're talking about authoritarianism, we're not talking about coercion or a bad person doing something bad. We're specifically talking about a political regime in which the apex leadership has no direct connection to the rest of the population, right? So it's not chosen through elections with uncertain outcomes, with competing parties, things of that nature, right? So there's a detachment between that. Specifies the regime, and then we have to get into more detail as to what exactly it looks like, how it's structured, and so on. Illiberalism, as an ideological component, can be layered on top of that, right, to provide substance to what the regime believes, how it acts, what kind of policies it pushes forward. But it's important to understand that this is an overlap rather than something that is necessary for it, right? So there are plenty of authoritarian regimes that don't have a particular ideology. They're not especially illiberal. Historically, there are a variety of authoritarian regimes we might have called liberal in certain ways. Certainly, a variety of non-constitutional monarchies or semi-constitutional monarchies fit that bill. Singapore, in some ways, also fits that bill as a liberal authoritarian regime today. So it all just sort of depends on what we mean by this. And what's interesting now, over the last decade or so, has been the overlap of illiberal reaction with certain styles of authoritarian politics, certain formats that we're seeing in places that had previously attempted to democratize and have backslid in various ways and largely maintain electoral democratic institutions. So we think of places like Hungary, for example, as another key touchstone when we want to throw the liberalism term around. Russia, of course, a few other places.
One follow-up question, and I'm sure this is a minefield question we could talk about for 3 hours, but I'm going to, Julian, try to make you do this in 2 minutes. So buckle up. Before we jump into the fascism question, what does Vladimir Putin believe now? This has been kind of talked about around Ukraine. Before he was accused of, and I'm not going to draw a firm conclusion, kind of this political nihilism. He's just looking for opportunity. Now he's sort of found religion. So what does that worldview kind of look like? And again, can you do this in 2 to 3 minutes? We'll see.
Yeah, I think that's a super easy order, of course. It's the trillion ruble question times another trillion rubles, just for good measure. We can't for certain tell you what Vladimir Putin thinks, but what we can say actually quite easily is that his views on the world have changed. That he is not the same person that he was 20, 25 years ago, especially in his public persona as the head of Russia, making substantive ideological comments on the world and on society. Right? Vladimir Putin used to be much more easily able to fit into the neoliberal box, more easily able to fit into sort of a apolitical technocratic box to a certain point. At some point, he got older and he became generically conservative. And then sometime around COVID, when he was spending multiple years in isolation with a few of his closest friends and easy access to Russian state archives, became increasingly obsessed about Ukraine and about this so-called triune unity of the East Slavic people. He became, in a way, through the observables that we have, a nationalist, of an imperial nationalist, that he wasn't before. And if you read an op-ed from 2014 or from 2009 or 2005 and call Vladimir Putin a nationalist, that's tough to make the case. You can make a bunch of different cases on what his actual ideological views were. By 2022, that's quite clear. He actually wrote us a whole historical essay confirming it, that these are in fact his views. And they're sort of classical nationalist views of sort of making the state and the nation congruent with a specific understanding of what the nation is. That's very, very different than what it was before. And Marlene, you can add on that as well. But his views have very clearly changed.
Marlene, anything to tag on? And then we will get to the meat and potatoes of this episode.
No, I agree with Julian. I think it's really important to realize when we talk about Putin that we are talking about a regime that has been a quarter of century. And so there have been evolution the same way as the West has evolved. So there have been evolution of the man himself, evolution of the country and the regime around him, and evolution of Russia's relationship with the West. And that has this sedimentation process has gradually shaped the view of the man up to the point where, as Julian was saying, he has been shifting now to something that can more clearly identify that before as a kind of imperial nationalism, especially in its relationship toward Ukraine, which doesn't mean it's ethno-nationalism. We're talking about Russia's own domestic plurality and diversity.
So I think we arrive at the main question of this episode, the F word. What is fascism? How can we think about that concept? And Marlene, we'll let you start here.
Yeah, there have been, of course, several definitions possible, and scholars have been debating the term with very either extensive or kind of restrictive definition. I use a pretty restrictive definition that sees fascism as having a utopian ideology that believes in regeneration of the nation through violence. So it means you need to have the will of a permanent mobilization of the society, and you need to believe that through war, you will create a new mankind. And so if you use that definition, what I try to demonstrate in the book is that before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia was not fitting that definition. It was a conservative or reactionary authoritarian regime which wanted demobilization of the society, because that's the civic contract between the state and the Russian society that has been built since Putin's arrival in power in the early 2000s, is precisely the demobilization of society, and it's being very far away from the state and from politics. And there was no utopia of regeneration except in some military, paramilitary far-right circle, which were not totally disconnected from the Kremlin, the political entity, but you couldn't say that the Russian state in its kind of entirety would fit that definition of fascism as violence to create new mankind and permanent mobilization of the society.
So I guess a question, if I'm going to push back, devil's advocate here, but Russia's now considerably more mobilized, maybe not politically mobilized, but certainly is in economic terms and in military terms has pushed for greater mobilization. I'll kick this one to Julian. Does that mean trouble for that definition, or does that make Russia more fascist? And I guess, comma, or semicolon, maybe more accurately, are there other frames you can think of that you can use to investigate whether or not a system is fascist here?
So there's probably 2 hours worth of conversation from that question alone. I think to take the easiest one, when we talk about mobilization, we're not talking about like the partial mobilization that happened the other year after the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the summer and early fall of 2022, with 300,000 new conscripts being brought into the Russian army. That's not the kind of mobilization we're referring to when we're referring to mobilization as part of a fascism definition. This is social mobilization, societal mobilization. It's much more aligned with what we might understand the totalitarianism school of political order, right, which argues that the totalizing state intervenes in society such that everyone cannot be depoliticized or be demobilized, but has to be constantly a part of political processes. There has to be party cadres in every school, right, in every workplace. There has to be regular rallies, mobilizations. You are part of a variety of groups, right? That's more of what we mean when we talk about fascism and we talk about mobilization. We don't really see that in Russia today. We're very, very far from. We have now ideological content being officially pushed by the Kremlin, right? That is something different. There's now official curricula being pushed out in universities. There's a lot more money going to cultural programs and so on. There is a new youth, mobilized youth group that exists that's kind of modeled on the pioneers. This is one of Kirienko's projects. None of that is really what we're talking about when we're talking about fascist mobilization. And so, without taking too much more time, it is relevant to talk about why we have these kind of bespoke definitions of fascism, because Marlene has chosen a very, very sophisticated one from, I think it's Roger Griffin, with the palingenetic, ultra-nationalist, ultra-violent mobilized component, and that's in the literature a common one, because it comes from a project of trying to extrapolate out from the very, very few cases of fascism we actually have in the real world. And this is part of the problem with using the word in the scholarly sense, is because there's a universe of cases problem. There's really only two unambiguously independent sovereign fascist states in all of history. It's Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And if you know anything about Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, they're actually quite distinct. So you're inductively deriving out an ideological descriptor from two cases that are not quite the same from the 1920s and 1930s. You're combining that with a variety of fascist movements that exist at a different level of analysis, right? They're not states, they're not regimes, they're fascist movements, fascist parties, and so on. Adding on a layer of countries that were either conquered by the Nazis, right? So there's a variety of sort of para-fascist, semi-fascist states that emerge in Europe during the conquest of Europe in the 40s. And then you tack on a few other cases that kind of fit, right? Like Franco's Spain or Salazar's Portugal or Metaxas's Greece. And you say that's kind of fascism, scholarly wise. But what's the defining characteristic that knits all these things together? And that's a really, really, really difficult problem. And Marlene can talk more about that.
I mean, we can debate the history here. I'm just thinking of the Franco example. I mean, definitely a dictatorship, not really about purifying humanity and creating utopia. Guy didn't join World War II, which was, theoretically the opportunity to do that. Interesting. Marlene, let's kick this to you. What would be like a broader definition here? When people say Russia's fascist, what do they mean in your view?
Yeah, I think that's where we need to, because as Julian was saying, the scholarly definition is a pretty narrow and limited one, but the use of the term in the policy and media world is a super extensive one. If you consider that many people who belongs to what we would call the far right are very often labeled as fascist. And so that's also what I wanted to do in the book, is that to have the academic discussion, but also to recognize that the academic discussion is part of a policy and media world. And we don't, as scholars, we don't control the way this label is circulating. And so for me, the way the label of fascism is used for Russia has always had a more kind of political and strategic goal of kind of pushing Russia away and kind of making Russia exceptional in the kind of on the international scene as a way to isolate the country, to say it's not legitimate, and to push it as outside of the kind of Western experience. And so the way I was reacting as a scholar was to say, well, no, I think indeed you have a continuum on which Russia may be an extreme case, but then you have other cases in Europe. You had at that time Trump in the US. So you have many elements that show that what we were considering at the kind of liberal democratic framework is getting challenged from different sides and excluding other arriving Russia as a kind of exceptional, evil empire, always bad, always our kind of essential other, is kind of making a geostrategic decision to kind of exclude Russia, but that's not really fitting the kind of scholarly analysis on what we know of Russia's experience in the collapse of the Soviet Union and over 30 years of experience, and slowly getting decoupled from the Western experience, which was not the case in the 90s. So I also have in the book chapters on how this kind of label of fascism is a strategic tool to either decide, is Russia part of Europe and a kind of legitimate actor when we discuss European security architecture, or if not? And when you use fascism, you kind of push Russia away from the European world and even from the international scene by saying that, well, if that's evil, if Russia is the same as the Nazi regime, then it has no legitimacy to talk to us and us to it, and there is no way we can kind of find an agreement. So it's a way of kind of, otherizing and externalizing Russia, which I think has very clear kind of geostrategic reasons, but I don't think that scholarly speaking, it's very meaningful.
Julian, over to you. Russia in 2024. We have, I think, time for one more question. Is Russia fascist now? More fascist? How fascist are we?
No, not very fascist. It still doesn't apply. And it doesn't apply for a few reasons. The first reason is that we have perfectly good conceptual tools that work better, right? It's a more consolidated, personalist, authoritarian regime. We can actually use the term dictatorship in the proper sense of this sort of emergency rule. If you take your Carl Schmitt seriously, or you take your Latin seriously, dictatorship is not actually a stand-in for any kind of non-democracy. And Russia has this sort of state of exception, state of emergency that's ongoing, that all of the political elites in Russia are aware of. That's why all these reshuffles had such tension and concern. How much was going to change? How much wasn't? It's up to the whim of the dictator, truly, in this case, right? So this is an authoritarian regime. It's quite closed, relatively speaking. It's more closed than it used to be. We can think of it as less pluralist. We can think of it as more ideological. All of those are perfectly reasonable ways to talk about Russia today without getting bogged down into the fascism debate. It doesn't fit with the sort of ultra-violent rebirth of the nation claim, at least not at the level of the regime, the level of the ideology. I think you can, however, if you really, really want to use fascism in the Russian case, there are two ways in which you can do so, I think, and this is fair. First, you have to take it out of the regime conversation and turn it into the level of individual ideologues, right, or individual figures. So you can bring in Alexander Dugin, who is just been named the head of the new Ivan Ilin higher political school at the Russian State Humanities University. And Dugin is many things. He's also long been sort of castigated as a fascist. Some of that's true. Some of it was more debated. But after the war, it's actually quite unambiguous. In fact, he fits the Griffin definition very, very, very well. If you read his output over the last 2+ years, you get a very strong sense of quite literally a rebirth of the nation through the purification of violence in the context of Ukraine, with a utopian eschatology moving forward. Dugin is, from a scholarly point of view, a fascist, like straight up, according to our definitions. I think that's quite clear. There is a more marginal case to be made for some of the statements from Patriarch Kirill the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, who has sometimes talked also in terms of a rebirth of the nation. I think that's a little bit more, if we're being fair, a little bit more stretched, if only because of the unique rhetoric and terms deployed by Orthodox clergymen, which often involve kind of rebirth in Christ, for example. That's not a fascist statement, right? That's a traditional religious statement. It's a doctrinal statement. So we have to be careful when he's using some of these terms, which also have sort of a rhetorical toolbox that's very different. He has made statements that do align with this sort of understanding of fascism. So you can get down into individuals. You can look at certain networks, Konstantin Malafeyev's network of institutions and media programs and so on, and see some of that. But Russia, the regime itself, the polity, the state, no, not fascist.
Marlene, over to you for the last word here.
Yeah, I agree with Julian. I think we should be very careful when we try to look even in the context of the war, because the war has been indeed becoming an ideology in itself for the regime. This kind of state of exception is a nice way for a leader to stay in power and to keep down any kind of criticism. And we have seen indeed a kind of re-ideologization becoming much more visible, and especially toward young people. But when you read, for example, the new curriculum and syllabi that have been made mandatory, it looks very Soviet, and Soviet from the 70s and 80s, so kind of late Soviet history and narrative. You are very far from the kind of Dugin's type of regeneration through violence. So indeed, there have been over the 2.5 years of war, sometimes some comments in some of Putin's speeches, in some speeches by some high-level figure like Nikolai Patrushev and by Patriarch Kirill. You can find some sentences that would technically fit a definition or a scholarly definition of fascism, but it's a little bit the trees that hides the forest, because if you look at the whole spectrum of what the Russian bureaucracy is producing in terms of ideology, you are getting much closer to a kind of old-fashioned late Soviet narrative than you are to a kind of classic fascist way. So, and of course because you have violence due to the war, you tend to over-interpret that violence, which is the war violence, with the kind of ideological framing of the regime. But in practice, the two things are very much dissociated by the Russian state itself. It's why in the Russian language, it's called a special military operation, because it has to remain special. It's not an all-encompassing war where all the society has to be mobilized. It's something segregated compared to a kind of normal, with quotation marks, the normality of what should be the Russian society and the Russian politics outside of uniquely the violence linked to the war.
Marlene and Julian, thank you for joining the Bear Market Brief podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you to Marlene and Julian, and to you, listener, for joining. So what do you think? Does the F word apply here? What does it mean to use the word fascist? Let us know at the Twitter and/or X handle @BearMarketBrief. The Bear Market Brief podcast and BMB Russia and Eurasia are a project of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that's FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and on many others, be sure to visit fpri.org. We'll catch you next time.